importance of migration, when we link it to the word crisis, is that this is a frame. This is a frame that was already put there back in 2015, 2016, when we started talking about the large number of people that were coming to Europe, looking for protection, looking for a new life. So migration crisis is a frame, and it was already put in our brains, and whoever brings first actually has an advantage already towards the others, because in all the rest of us understand migration within this context, within this frame. This is why, for example, in headlines, the headlines of the news report are so important. First of all, it's alerting the reader what is in the article and the reason why the story is relevant. But it's actually setting the frame. It's telling us what we expect to read in that article. Lots of us just go through skimming headlines, and these headlines and these words that we see unconsciously are already getting into our brains, are already framing how we understand the situation of things that are happening. This is how the human brain works. But for example, already back in 2017, FRA director in a meeting that we had, a conference organized by the Committee of the Region here in Vienna, said that when we use migration crisis, we are already putting the blame on the migrant. Instead, what we should be talking actually from the very beginning is of the political crisis on how to deal with the large number of people that are in need of protection and asylum in the EU. Labeling in this case is very pervasive, because even though it helps us understand something about the person, it's actually reducing the person to a very simple act, which is, for example, an asylum seeker, a person in need of asylum. Well, a person is just more than this one-dimensional act. We should be probably talking about the reasons why this person is in need of protection. Maybe it's a woman who is trying to escape a forced marriage, or a transsexual who is suffering terrible discrimination in their home country. Maybe it's a political activist. Maybe it's a father, a doctor who's trying to escape from a city where bombs are just falling and where his life is at risk and the life of his children. So this is why labeling and terminology when we talk about migration has to be really thought about and put into the right context, in order not just to put a person into the label. A person is so much more than just that. The most important thing I have learned as a journalist, and then during this last year, is working with journalists on a new online toolkit that's called the e-media toolkit that the EU Agency of Fundamental Rights have done together with newsrooms and media organizations. It's actually that journalists are the best storytellers. They are the professional storytellers, and we need to work with them. But they're also great gatekeepers, and they can frame the story, and they can tell us in an unbiased way how to understand migration. But editors and journalists are like I was, is like any one of us, and any one of us has unconscious bias. And the problem with unconscious bias is that they are unconscious. So a lot of them don't really know that they have these biases, and don't know that when, for example, they are going to cover a story of migration, they are already coming with some prejudices. They have already made up their mind regarding to the story of migration. And these preconceptions and prejudices are actually being put on the story and the way they are reporting about it. This is how, and the reason why we in institutions need to work with journalists and to how we frame migration. We need to help them. This means that we need to understand what makes news, and we need to adhere and tell them to remember the principles of ethical journalism that they all have, and the codes of journalism that they all have in the newsroom. What does it mean in concrete? Well, it means that they have to report on facts, not on biases. And for this, journalists need to really ask themselves, for example, are we acting independently from narratives that stem from politics and emotions rather than facts? This is the question they need to make themselves. They should also be asking themselves if they are reporting fairly and transparently about the impact of migration on communities. A lot of the stories are just about the persons of the situation of the migrants, many times without even asking the migrants, and many other times without asking the people in which these migrants are arriving, how is this affecting their daily lives? And this is important. This is very important. Another thing that journalists should know is about the law, and this is where we can help them a lot. It is very important that they understand how to use the proper terms when they frame and when they tell about a story. It's not the same thing to talk about a story of a victim of trafficking or the story of a person in need of asylum or of a refugee. Another thing is that journalists should think about themselves. Well, are we using the word irregular migrant appropriately? Or migrant worker? What does it mean? Why are we talking about this person as being an economic migrant and maybe not another better term, which is usually used for people working in institutions like we are suddenly expats instead of economic migrants? We should think about this and think if it makes sense. And of course, then journalists should be aware that the way they're using laws and I quote in the laws, if this is the real way of doing it, if they are really understanding what are the rights of migrants and these laws, and also think about what are the country's legal obligations. But I think one of the most important things for journalists in the newsroom is about humanity. The profession of journalism is not a profession to make any harm. Journalists should make no harm, and they should help people understand what's happening without harming and hurting others. This is a way for the journalists to really think about keeping their emotions in check, to avoid the victimization of these people, of the persons they're talking about, to to do not oversimplify, as well as to just don't just talk about the very narrow humanitarian context, but try to put it into the bigger picture of this person is just not escaping a city where bombs are falling. Why are those bombs falling? And why is this person now in this terrible situation that it has to just get away as fast as possible to save their lives? And as I said before, it is very important not to reduce the person just to their administrative migration status. So, for example, if a person is in this need of asylum, it's not just the story about how is in need of asylum. It is actually to make us feel and understand in which awful situation these persons finds themselves, that they just need to flee and forget about everything they have achieved in their life and try to look for a new life, a second opportunity somewhere else. There is a lot more than that. And we need to try that the reader is not feeling pity or sorrow for the terrible situation in which this person has been going through, but empathy. Maybe we could talk about the dreams of the person. Maybe we can talk about a mother who's willing to do anything to give her children a chance, a better education, an education that maybe she never had because maybe she was forced into child marriage at the age of 13 or 14 years old. All these things need to be taken into consideration. And it's also important for journalists that they need to understand that it's very important who you give the voice, who you quote in your reports. So are we listening to the right communities? Are we, when we are, for example, talking to a representative of a group of people, are they really representative? I think it's very important to be aware that usually the voices of women are very underreported. And migrant women are never, or very rarely, given the opportunity to tell about their story and what they have been going through. And I think linked to this, it's very important when you know who you give your mic to, who you're going to quote, and who you decide to quote, to challenge the hate. Just because a politician is using inflammatory language regardless of how high rank these politicians have. I think the journalists should remind themselves that they're just not mere mic holders. They are gatekeepers. They need to know if that inflammatory language actually plays any role whatsoever in understanding the situation that they're trying to explain. So journalists don't think about the status of the speaker, what is the intention of the language that he's using, and how this language actually could incite to hate and harm others. Because as I said before, the job of a journalist is not to harm anyone. It is to give light, to give understanding, to understand the why of the situation. And the why of the situation doesn't need to harm anyone on the way to understand it. That's why it's very important that words like, for example, swarms, floods, wave, they have to be treated with extreme cautious because they are dehumanizing, extremely dehumanizing. And when we are dehumanizing someone, then we don't think that person is like us. And this is actually what we need to break. We need to make sure journalists understand that the persons they're talking about are mothers, our fathers, our children with dreams, our grandparents who just want to maybe see their children grow up in a country where there is no danger. This is why also it should be very important with journalists to think about when to use the word racism, when to use the word xenophobia. They have to be used with extreme cautious because they can be pointing fingers to people that shouldn't be that used. So words and terminology are crucial, and the journalists play a fundamental role in choosing as gatekeepers what is the true information, the real information we need to reach. Nowadays, there is information everywhere. There is so much information, and this is like enough floating. You have so much water around you, and actually what you need the most is to know out of all this water, how much is drinkable water. And it's the same thing happening with information. We have so much information around us. The difficulty, and this is where journalists really have to help us, is to let us know what is the information that is really, really worth acknowledging, reading, and that give us the context, give us the why of the situation.